of August, and their tour starts at the Castle Hotel Manchester on the 20th of September. You can check their website for further details. Thanks to everybody. That's the Loose Ends tied up for another week. If you just missed the programme, if you want to hear it again, you can find it and dozens of previous editions of Loose Ends in the cornucopia that is BBC Sounds, including recent interviews with Geezer Butler and Jamie Winston. Thank you to all of this week's guests, Ravneet Gill and Leslie Sharp, Lilo, Andrew O'Neill and DJ Fat Tony. Today's producer is Claire Bartley. To the studio managers Duncan Hannant and Andrew Garrett. Next week, Annika Rice's guests will include Governor B and the Coral. But for me, for now, goodbye.
Loose Ends was presented by Clive Anderson. As Clive said, if you'd like to hear a longer version of the programme, just search for Loose Ends on BBC Sounds.
Steffi Graf, the defending champion, just waiting for hush.
Gives the ball a couple of bounces.
Nadal serves at deuce.
It's a lovely little loft from Alcaraz.
Slice forehand from Williams.
Martina comes to the net.
It's outstanding defence from Murray. In steps Djokovic. He's trying to win it here.
Every epic moment.
I can't believe what I'm watching.
Oh, that's too good.
Don't miss a thing from Wimbledon, with live coverage of all 18 courts. Starts tomorrow. Watch on iPlayer. Listen on BBC Sounds.
After which, it pains me to say, here's the weather forecast. Tonight will become mostly dry for much of England and South Wales, with clearing skies. West Scotland, Northern Ireland, North and West Scotland and North Wales will be cloudier with scattered showers. It'll be less breezy. Tomorrow, however, Wales and England will see a band of showery rain sweep in from the west. The rain could be heavy in places before giving way to further scattered showers. Northern Ireland and Scotland will have sunshine and showers, but the north of Scotland will be cloudy with more general rain. Tuesday will see showers, possibly thundery for most. Heavy rain is likely in the south for a time. Wednesday will continue unsettled in the north. However, it will be mainly dry in the south with sunny spells and just the odd shower. Well, it is Wimbledon. This is BBC Radio 4.
It's 10 o'clock. Welcome to 60 minutes of news and conversation with me, Leila Nathu, and my guests. This is the Westminster Hour. The main news tonight. The grandmother of the teenager shot dead by French police has appealed for calm after 5 nights of violence. The head of NHS England has urged the government and doctors' unions to end their disputes, saying patients are paying the price for continued strike action. And nearly 4,000 people crossed the Channel in small boats last month, a record figure for June. Coming up on the programme, it's 75 years old this week, but is the NHS still in rude health? On my panel to discuss the state of the health service, the chair of the NHS Confederation, Lord Adebowale. Alongside him, the Conservative MP Tim Lawton and Shadow Cabinet Minister Thangam Debonair. Katie Balls, the political editor of The Spectator, will be our expert guide to the week ahead, including a big Labour announcement on plans for the education system. And we have a preview of a plan to cut immigration, being put forward tomorrow by a new Tory backbench pressure group.
There's a chasm between where most of the public are at when it comes to the level of migration they'll be comfortable with and the reality of the present situation. That chasm needs to be narrowed. It's unhealthy for it to be so large, and it's bad for our democracy.
That's all after the news, read for us this evening by John Hammond.
President Macron has met ministers and security officials this evening to discuss the 5 nights of violence which have followed the fatal shooting of a teenager by police in Paris. Early today, there was an attempt to set fire to the home of a mayor in the suburbs of the city. The grandmother of the dead teenager has appealed for calm, as Electra Naismith reports.
The grandmother of the 17-year-old Nadia accused rioters of using her grandson as a pretext. She reminded them that it was mothers who took the buses they were burning, mothers who walked the streets. She said she resented the officer who shot her grandson during a traffic stop, but that it wasn't directed at other police. It was fortunate they were there, she said. She trusted in justice. The number of arrests overnight in France was down sharply, but an attack on the home of a mayor in a Paris suburb has been widely condemned.
For another night, 45,000 police are being deployed across France. The head of the Greater Paris region, Valérie Pécresse, said she believed calm would soon return.
I am confident that violence will decrease in the following days. All the troops, the forces are on the field and working on building a new security in the region. So I'm very confident. But what's happening is ultra-violence by small groups of people that are very well organized.
The head of NHS England, Amanda Pritchard, has said patients are paying the price for continued strikes. Junior doctors are due to walk out again this month, and consultants have also voted in favour of action. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, told the BBC pay demands needed to be balanced against the need to deal with inflation. Here's our political correspondent, Tony Bonsignora.
The prospect of further strike action by doctors is threatening to overshadow this week's celebrations to mark the 75th anniversary of the founding of the NHS. Junior doctors are planning to walk out for 5 days later this month, followed shortly after for the first time by consultants for 2 days. On the BBC's Sunday with Laura Koonsberg programme, Amanda Pritchard urged the two sides to resolve the dispute, warning that the strike by senior doctors would be particularly problematic.
Consultants going out on strike is a different level of challenge again to what we've had to respond to with junior doctors, because they can't cover in the same way. So there is no doubt that the sooner that we can bring this to a resolution, the better for patients, because we've already had well over 500,000 appointments rescheduled. We can't let it become business as usual for the NHS.
The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, said he was working very closely with the NHS on how to mitigate the impacts of the strikes. He also said the government stood ready to have discussions, for example over reforms to contracts that would improve pay progression. But he wouldn't commit to any further pay rises and again dismissed junior doctors' demands for a 35% increase as unaffordable. Labour is urging the government to enter into talks with the unions, but wouldn't say what pay deal it would offer if it were in power.
Labour has also said it would reintroduce the requirement for all new teachers to have a formal teaching qualification if it wins the next election. The party would also offer a payment of £2,400 to newer teachers in England to try to stop them leaving the profession. The Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, said she wanted to reset the relationship between government and teachers. The White House has announced that President Biden will visit the UK in a week's time as part of a European trip. He's expected to meet the King as well as the Prime Minister after his arrival next Sunday. Mr. Biden will then head to Lithuania for a NATO summit before stopping off in Finland for a meeting with Scandinavian leaders. More than 3,800 migrants crossed the Channel in small boats last month, the highest figure on record for June. It brings the total number of people arriving this year to more than 11,000. Simon Jones reports.
With calm seas and warm weather, 3,824 migrants arrived on 79 boats last month. At the start of June, Rishi Sunak visited Dover on a windy day when there were no crossings to declare the government's plan to stop the boats was making a difference, thanks to a new returns agreement with Albania and increased patrols on French beaches. He said crossings in the first 5 months of the year had fallen by 20% compared with the same period last year. But with last month's record figures, that reduction now stands at around 10%. Critics say the weather is having a far greater effect on the numbers than government policy.
The friend of Stephen Lawrence, who was with him when he was murdered in 1993, says he could have identified a sixth suspect in the killing if he had been given the opportunity by police. Stephen, who was 18, was killed in Eltham in southeast London 30 years ago. Last week, the BBC, for the first time, named Matthew White as a suspect in the murder investigation. He died in 2021. But Dwayne Brooks said there was no doubt in his mind that he could have identified White at the time.
Not only did I describe him as best I could, you had other witnesses at the bus stop who also described him. I am 100% certain that if that person was put before me and the other witnesses in the initial stages of the investigations on an ID parade, we all would have picked him out.
Rail passengers could face disruption over the next week because of an overtime ban by some train drivers. 15 rail companies based in England will be affected from tomorrow. It's the latest action in ASLEF Union's long-running pay dispute. Councillors on Orkney are considering proposals that could change the island's status within the UK or even see them become a self-governing territory of Norway. They were a part of the Scandinavian country until 1472 when they were handed over to Scotland. Other options they could look at include becoming a crown dependency or an overseas territory of the UK, like the Falkland Islands. The council leader, James Stocken, says it comes down to the funding Orkney receives.
This isn't just flying a kite. This is asking a question that has been asked for all of my life. Is there other opportunities? Being part of the North Kingdom for much longer than being part of the United Kingdom in the past, and now with telecommunications or with transport routes, all things are possible.
Tributes have been paid to the former head of the civil service, Lord Kerslake, who's died at the age of 68. He'd recently been diagnosed with cancer. Lord Kerslake led the civil service from 2012 to 2014 during David Cameron's coalition government and was also permanent secretary at the Department for Communities and Local Government. He later chaired the independent inquiry into the Manchester Arena bombing. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said Lord Kerslake had been a talented public servant, utmost professional and a good man. Sport now. In cricket, England's men have lost the second Ashes test at Lord's, leaving them a mountain to climb if they're to win the series. Despite an astonishing innings from Ben Stokes, the home side fell 43 runs short of their target to give Australia a 2-0 lead overall. Eleanor Oldroyd was watching.
For a heady hour after lunch, it felt as if the miracle of Headingley 2019 was set to be repeated. Sparked into life by the controversial stumping of Johnny Bairstow by Alex Carey, Ben Stokes set out to win the Test match single-handed. He hit 155 off 214 balls, including 9 sixes, but this time he couldn't quite get his team close enough. When he was out, they were still 70 short. The normally polite Lord's crowd were loud and hostile. Australia's players jostled in the long room as they went off for lunch. The contest may have combusted, but Australia have at least one hand on the urn, with the third test at Headingley 3 days away.
The Marylebone Cricket Club has suspended 3 of its members after the apparent confrontation in the Lord's Pavilion. Cricket Australia said their players had been verbally abused and physically contacted. The MCC said the behaviour was completely unacceptable and has apologised. Max Verstappen has claimed his 5th win in a row at Formula One's Austrian Grand Prix. The Red Bull driver finished ahead of Ferrari's Charles Leclerc and his teammate Sergio Perez. In cycling, Britain's Adam Yates has retained the leader's yellow jersey after the second stage of the Tour de France. He finished 19th on the stage, which was won by France's Victor Lafay.
John, many thanks. You're listening to the Westminster Hour with me, Leila Nathu, and my guests. I'm pleased to say I have almost a full house with me in the studio. Tim Lawton, though, joins us on the line. He is the Conservative MP for East Worthing and Shoreham. He's a former Children's Minister and he is also a member of the Home Affairs Select Committee. Good evening to you, Tim.
Good evening, Leila.
Have you been gripped by the cricket this weekend? Prime Minister certainly came alive yesterday on Test Match Special.
I certainly have, and I watched it this afternoon, which was a bit embarrassing because we had some friends over for lunch, so we had to have a laptop on the table. Yes, but it was... Ben Stokes was fantastic, and gosh, almost did it, but thrilling. But anyway, we're now 2-0 down.
Oh, I know, hasn't gone our way. Labour's Thangham Debonair is also here. She represents Bristol West. She swapped a career in classical music for politics, and she is the shadow leader of the Commons. Thangham, thanks for being with us. Do you still find time to play the cello?
I do. Yes, my string quartet, the statutory instrument. I know, see what we did there. Really in parliamentary joke, that one, I think. But we played recently in the House of Lords, and we played at the Women's Prize for Fiction, and we're just looking at the next few things we might be doing.
Lovely. Victor, did you hear Thangham's quartet at the...
No, I didn't.
No.
But I'll take the next opportunity, I'll be there.
Victor Adewale, who is, I'm sure you are also somebody in politics with hidden talents. You sit in the House of Lords as a crossbench peer. He began his career in social housing, then ran Turning Point, a charity which helps people with...
Social enterprise.
Social enterprise, thank you, which helps people with drug and alcohol issues. Now, Victor, you now chair the NHS Confederation. I'm going to describe it in a very short, crude way as the membership organisation representing the healthcare system in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Perhaps you could give us your own description?
No, we're the largest representative body of healthcare leaders in the UK, but that'll do.
OK, great. We're there. Many thanks to all of you. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. Now, as I mentioned at the start, we will be looking at the state of the NHS and Labour's plans for schools. But I want to just begin with one of those stories we heard in our news bulletin. More than 3,000 people crossing the Channel. Katie, I just realised I forgot to say that Katie Balls, of course, the political editor of The Spectator, is with you. I was just about to come to you and realised I hadn't introduced you. Forgive me.
Forgiven. And I have heard, not to get back to statutory instruments, but I have heard Thangham's quartet and the cello, and it was very good.
Maybe that will be a treat for Westminster Hour on another occasion. Anyway, sorry for this. Let's return, Katie, because I wanted to start with you on the story we heard in the news bulletin of a record number of people crossing the Channel in small boats in June. The Prime Minister has, of course, promised to stop the boats. Last week, we heard the appeal court ruling that said sending people to Rwanda, sending asylum seekers to Rwanda, a key part of the government's approach to this, would be unlawful. At the start of June, Rishi Sunak said his plan was starting to work. Is it?
I think it looks uphill. I think of all the 5 priorities, Stop the Boats was seen by Tory MPs and some ministers as by far the most ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. Some described it as brave in the sense of, would there be enough progress? No one actually thinks you can completely stop the boats, but will there be enough to point to? We're now at a point where I think all 5 priorities are seeing various problems, but as you say, that Court of Appeal judgment last week, I think is a setback for the government. Now the expectation in government is that they'll be heading to a Supreme Court verdict. It's worth pointing out that the Court of Appeal judgment, which found the scheme unlawful, was a split judgment. So 2 of the 3 judges found it to be unlawful, 1 did not. And I think therefore there's some hope in government the Supreme Court could still go in their favour. But it means when you're thinking about the Rwanda scheme, which is a huge part of the Stop the Boats plan, because you can talk about the returns deals with Albania, work with the French authorities, but it's really the Rwanda scheme that ministers think will be the game changer. It now is really hard to see a flight getting off this year. It's much more next year if you think about potentially October for the Supreme Court, a verdict perhaps 6 weeks later, and that means there's not that much time really for Rishi Sunak to get this scheme fully going. And you also have the illegal migration bill going through Parliament, which you need to become law, so you could actually, along with the court judgment, if you can make it go up on scale. So there's still several things that need to go in Rishi Sunak's favour, and right now he does not seem to be a Prime Minister that is getting much in the way of good luck.
So parallel problems there for the government, Rwanda getting held up by the appeal court, and also the illegal migration bill getting attacked and amended in the House of Lords. It's going to be up there again this week. Now, Tim, you said in the Commons this week, after the Rwanda appeal court ruling came through, that you shared the Home Secretary's disappointment at that judgment. So you want the Rwanda plan to go ahead. Is it actually going to happen before the next general election?
I hope so. Can I also chip in and say I've heard Thangham's statutory instruments, and they are very good. They've played in the House of Commons. I think Emily Benn, one of my old sparring partners, one of the players as well. Just currying favour with the opposition there. So back to Rwanda. Yeah, Rwanda is a controversial scheme. It is one of a number of measures that the government is trying to take to deal with the whole small boats issue. And I think all of us will be agreed that whatever you think about how many people we should take with asylum claims coming to the United Kingdom, coming across the Channel, the busiest shipping lane in the world, by paying ruthless people smugglers is the worst possible way to do it. And that's why it's absolutely got to be stopped. The Rwanda scheme is certainly a deterrent, and the Home Affairs Select Committee, when we went to Calais back in January looking at all of this, the one thing we were told by the local officials was that when the Rwanda scheme was actually announced last year, there was a surge in migrants who were in Calais approaching the French authorities about regularising their position in France because they didn't want to risk being then transported to Rwanda. So certainly there is a deterrent factor there, but of course as it hasn't happened, not a single plane has taken off because of the court rulings and further appeals have gone on, then obviously that deterrent factor has gone away. What I would also say is the French approached us, and I had meetings with German MPs recently saying actually they're quite interested in a similar scheme for the problems that they have there. So what I suggested is we should be working with other European partners to see if we can have a scheme that acts as a deterrent, acting in unison, because this has got to be dealt with. It's in nobody's interest to have people coming across in small boats in the Channel, and it really bumps down the queue those genuine asylum seekers for whom we've got to do more on safe and legal routes, which we have now got in the illegal migration bill, and the government needs to get on with that.
Well, just briefly on the deterrent effect, because the government's own economic impact assessment said, didn't it, that it was impossible to model what the deterrent effect would be. So that is really not clear on that, but you still think that it will have a deterrent effect when it comes into force. But just to be clear, you are also proposing changes to the illegal migration bill as it's going through Parliament.
Absolutely, and when it was in the Commons, it's now in the Lords. It's got several days in report stage before it comes back to the Commons. I set down a list of amendments, and we got some concessions from the government in the Commons and some promises of further details in the Lords. And I was focusing particularly on safe and legal routes. That is now a very clear pledge within the bill. It's a question of timing and the extent of them, and there's going to be more amendments put down in the Commons. And I think it's really important that if you are going to have a tough migration policy, clamping down on those people who really don't have a legitimate claim to be in the UK, then you've got to balance that with making it easier and more straightforward and safer for those who do have the prospect of safe haven in the UK, being able to come here safely and legally without paying people smugglers and coming across the Channel. And then there's various issues around child detention, pregnant women, and also trafficking as well. So there's going to be a lot of amendments in the Lords which we'll be dealing with back in the Commons over the next few weeks to make this bill better, but it does need to go through because this can't go on.
Victor, you've been in the Lords as this bill has been going through. You've seen the amendments that have been made to the legislation. What have you made of the discussion there among peers?
Well, I mean, the peers are doing their job and they're trying to improve the bill, but they've voted down many of the government's amendments in the bill. I just think that we need to think about these people as people. Many of these people have escaped the most horrendous circumstances, and in all the sort of anti-woke populist politics, I think we should just remember that these are human beings at the end of the day. And the evidence would be that the Rwanda scheme doesn't have a lot of merit practically. It's not just me. We just look at what the judges are saying. You've mentioned the deterrent effect and the evidence for that. My personal view is that we should focus on safe routes. We should focus on effective administration of the asylum system, because there's no law against people seeking asylum, and we should treat people who are escaping the most horrendous circumstances with decency, and we should encourage other countries to do the same.
So would you like to see the Rwanda plan scrapped?
Well, I think, I'd like to see a return to decency and humanity in our approach to asylum seekers and immigration. That's what I'd like to see.
Sangam, decency and humanity. I think you've clarified now that Labour would stop the Rwanda flights if you were in power. Yes. What would you do instead to bring the numbers of people down?
I mean, we want to make sure, as Tim has said, this is a very dangerous piece of water. It's a very dangerous crossing. We don't want people crossing in that way. But unfortunately, the evidence is right in front of us that the numbers are not going down, and the government's own impact assessment, which wasn't just economic, it also looked at whether or not there was a deterrent effect, and it was unable to say that there was. So now we know that the government didn't know that it was going to be declared unlawful. They hadn't checked that out. They hadn't done an impact assessment until this week, by which time it's already been through most of its stages, so they didn't know themselves, or they certainly weren't telling the rest of us what the impact was. What we need to do is go after the criminal gangs, and if we scrapped the unworkable and expensive Rwanda scheme, which has so far cost £140 million of taxpayers' money without sending a single person other than two Home Secretaries to visit Rwanda, if we scrap that, we could use that money on a new cross-border police force to tackle the criminal gangs. We also ought to be sorting out safe and legal routes, and Tim did an excellent job actually in the Home Affairs Select Committee of pointing out that there are many, many people who would want to flee war and persecution but have no access to safe and legal routes, and we could even just start with the debt we owe to the people in Afghanistan who worked alongside British people and who were left behind in a chaotic evacuation after the fall of Kabul. I have constituents who've got relatives either still in Afghanistan or in neighbouring countries unable to be reunited with their families. We could sort out family reunion. That would be a start.
So do you accept, though, the government's view that actually there are people who are coming here for economic reasons, that there are economic migrants crossing the channel in small boats? So it's not just about offering safe and legal routes.
Until they've been assessed.
Do you accept that?
Well, how do we know until they've been assessed? And that's part of the problem. This is a backlog. This is not a legal migration bill so much as a backlog bill. We have a massive backlog of people who are in the asylum application system. When I was first an MP, you used to be able to find out where someone's application was in the process within a matter of hours, and most decisions were made within 6 months. And that meant that someone who was not entitled to be here could be sent home, and someone who was entitled to be here could get on with integrating, working, sending their kids to school, actually making a life here until it was safe for them to return home if that's what they wanted. Now, we can't do that anymore. So I don't really see on what basis the government is establishing that they think that there is X number of people who are economic migrants when their assessment system has ground to a virtual halt.
Tim, can I bring you in on the backlog there?
Well, the backlog is one of the problems. The backlog has actually come down quite a lot from the 166,000 that it was to 120-something now. But it's the 97,000, I think, the legacy which the Prime Minister's vowed to deal with. And I agree with Hang, it's got to be speeded up. There's just been an extra 500 people appointed to one of the assessment centres in Stoke, but it's not good enough. It needs to be speeded up, and I challenge the Home Secretary on that. The problem is, what Fangham has just said, there's not a single practical solution to deal with this problem that she's come up with. It's all very well saying we should have more money into a cross-border police force. We've given the French £500 million and an awful lot of kit, as a result of which they are intercepting more people getting on beaches and trying to come into boats, but they don't arrest them. They just let them go and take their boat away, and they're back again the following night with a different boat, and they try again. So the 140 million from the Rwanda scheme, on top of the 500 million that we're already giving the French police, that is not, I'm afraid, going to solve the problem. And if you're not going to send people back, because there are some countries you can't send people back, and if you're not going to have an agreement with a third country like Rwanda or another country, you'll be stuck with people who do not have a genuine asylum case to be in the UK, and that list and the numbers will only get greater and greater. So, Tang, I'm afraid you just do not have a solution.
I'm sorry, I don't know if I wasn't being crystal clear. I wasn't talking about giving more money to the French. I was talking about our own National Crime Agency having their own dedicated police unit and clearing the backlog. Without that, it's not working. Where are the prosecutions? This is what we need.
I think we could spend a lot more time discussing this, but I want to actually turn now to those who arrive in the UK very legally as students, to work, to join family members. But there is also some concern about the level of net legal migration. It reached 600,000 last year. Now, a group of Conservative backbenchers, calling themselves the New Conservatives, want more action on this, on legal migration, net migration. They will be launching their proposals tomorrow. Now, earlier this evening, I spoke to the author of the plan, the Ipswich MP Tom Hunt. I asked him first, who are the New Conservatives?
It's a group of members of Parliament who are very motivated about trying to restore the trust that was placed in us by the 2019 Conservative voters. Areas of the country that have never been represented by Conservative MPs are represented by Conservative MPs currently. So, in a sense, the group is about trying to repay that trust that was put in us by those voters and to try and ensure that they keep on board with the Conservative Party.
You think that the party has gone too far away from the 2019 manifesto. Immigration for you is one of the key issues. Why do you think immigration particularly is the one to focus on?
When I knock on doors, when I talk to constituents, immigration is a key issue that comes up time and time again. And I think that when I look at the town that I represent, I think over many decades we've had immigration into this town, and I think in many respects we've benefited from that. But I just think what we've seen over the last decade or so has been levels of immigration that I think have been too high. And actually, I think it's pretty clear from polling, the vast majority of the British public also believe that those levels have been far too high. So ultimately, this is about that 2019 manifesto that said that we would commit to decrease net migration, bring in high-quality immigration. We believe, the Prime Minister himself, he said that he wants the numbers to come down, as has the Home Secretary. Already the government have made steps, but some of the ideas in this paper we think will help the government go further.
Just talk us through the detail. Where do you think the main reductions in numbers of people will come from, according to your proposals?
We think to a certain degree it will come down in future because of that sort of one-off situation of the Ukrainian and Hong Kong refugees. However, even taking that into account, there's other things that really need to be done. What was announced with regards to student dependence and one-year taught masters, I think will make a contribution. We go a bit further than that. We also talk about one-year research masters. What we also do is look at the salary threshold that you need to reach to get a work visa. So we would look to increase that to 38,000, and also the English language requirement would go up from level 1 to level 2, and would also be slightly more discriminatory with regards to which universities are really being very active when it comes to international students. And there would be a bias towards higher quality institutions, higher quality courses. And we're also concerned that the student route has been used as a backdoor by some to get into the UK permanently. And one of the things we're doing in that regard is this sort of 2 to 3 year period that international students have after they finish their course. They can hang around in the UK even if they don't have a job. That would be ended.
What about lower paid jobs in sectors where employers are absolutely crying out for workers? I'm thinking of hospitality, agriculture. How do you propose then to fill the shortages in those sectors? Because I think also one of your proposals is closing schemes for care workers, which is already chronically understaffed.
We've got to move away from this addiction to cheap labour from abroad. We've got to invest in our own workforce. We've got to look at our education system, look at the role that's got to play in skilling up our own workforce. I think it's wrong that we've got so many people who are economically inactive in our own country, that we're relying upon this sort of mass migration as a way through this challenge. The debate also needs to be viewed in the round. It can't just be viewed about GDP figures. It also needs to be viewed about pressure on public services, pressure on housing, and we also need to be taking into account rapid social and cultural change that comes when you have that much flux. This plan would help us get back to just below where we were in 2019 as stage 1 for a blueprint of potentially going further than that. And actually, right now, there's a chasm between where most of the public are at when it comes to the level of migration they'd be comfortable with and the reality of the present situation. That chasm needs to be narrowed. It's unhealthy for it to be so large, and it's bad for our democracy.
Just finally, I mean, you say you want immigration, the debate around immigration, to be seen in the round, and it can't just be about GDP. Do you think then that Rishi Sunak has been too focused on growth and therefore accepting higher levels of immigration? Cutting immigration is not one of his 5 priorities, is it?
One of his 5 priorities is immigration related. And
well, it's illegal migration.
It's a significant aspect of migration. It's one of the key concerns of many of my constituents. This is a constructive document. We've finally got back control of our immigration system. We've ended EU free movement. I think it's healthy to have a level of debate within the parliamentary party about the future of our immigration policy, and we're fully supportive of the Prime Minister.
The Conservative MP Tom Hunt there. Victor, I wanted to come to you first on this, because you heard Tom talk about what he called an addiction to cheap labour from abroad. You are acutely aware of the vacancies in the NHS and its reliance on foreign workers. I wondered what you made of his proposals.
Well, they won't work. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we need people who come from abroad to work in our NHS and particularly in our social care system. My members want social care workers to be paid more, and we still need to fill the gap. I mean, I've been handed this piece of paper. I think that it's not very practical, to be honest. And I think we have an inflation problem with which this won't help. I can see why they're doing it, but I don't see the point of it.
Tim, what do you make of this intervention from one of your colleagues?
Well, I understand the frustration, particularly by some of my colleagues in Red Wall seats, and the frustration is largely as a result of the boats coming across the channel, where I think people see the injustice, and I agree, of people who can afford to pay people smugglers coming here in a regular way and effectively bumping down the queue those genuine asylum seekers for whom we need to have a duty of care, and I think are largely welcome in this country. And I agree with some of the points that Tom's made about an addiction to cheap labour, and that was a problem problem within Brexit, and it was a problem before Brexit, but a problem in many European countries as well. It was a race to the bottom, and that was what we learned out of the pandemic and everything else, that you actually need to have a secure, well-trained, well-paid workforce, and we need to do a lot better in that, and that's one of the reasons measures are happening in the health service, and we'll discuss that a little later. But I do agree with Victor. We have got a shortage of people in this country, particularly in the care industry, particularly in hospitality. I've got a coastal constituency. We're having a lot of challenges there, and it's not as simple as just putting the salary thresholds up as well. There's quite a lot of skilled but lower paid people that we need coming into this country. So in the longer term, the principle is right. I want to see more people trained in this country, working in our National Health Service, in our care industry, but I also want to see good quality graduates now from around the world, or undergraduates, coming to study in the United Kingdom, and then setting up business here, contributing here. I think there is a question mark over the number of dependents that are coming along with students as well. Certainly, I think we can do something on that. But I don't want to get hung up with numbers. That 606,000 net figure looks very worrying, and we've got a problem about accommodation. We've got a problem about the number of Afghan asylum seekers, genuine asylum seekers, legitimately brought here almost 2 years ago now, and they are left out of Kabul, and there's still something like 9,000 of them stuck in hotels, which just shows the problems we've got with long-term accommodation. But well over half of that 606,000 are Ukrainians. And the people coming from Hong Kong as well. Okay. So the numbers are slightly artificial in that respect, but it's a difficult balance.
Thangham, Tim doesn't want to get hung up on numbers. Labour does want net migration down, but you don't want to set a target.
Well, as Tim's just said, you know, when the situation in Ukraine and Hong Kong changes, they will inevitably go down. But I just want to focus on a couple of things that have been said there. References to cheap labour. Well, one of the things that the government could do, and a Labour government would do, is scrap the 20% discount, which means that people on the shortage occupation list can be paid only 80% of the going rate. That seems to me perverse, and it wasn't just me that says it's perverse. The Migration Advisory Committee themselves in 2021 said this was a very odd thing to do.
Katie, just briefly, if I may, I mean, you're very plugged into what's going on in the Tory party. What do you make of this? Tension simmering on the backbenches?
Yeah, I mean, I think tensions have been simmering in Cabinet too. If you go back recently to Suella Braverman's speech as Home Secretary, which she gave at the National Conservatism Conference, where you had the Home Secretary arguing that legal migration should be curbed. Of course, that is their brief. So you think, oh, who is the Home Secretary? But I think what it pointed to was not just a preempt of a policy they did announce, because we have had some new restrictions this year from the government, but also the tension there is between the Home Office and particularly the Treasury as to what do you do about growth, but also the impact on things like the care sector. What lots of these MPs, and the group, the New Conservatives, is largely red wall MPs, not everyone, curiously includes the Deputy Party Chairman, despite the fact it appears to be a pressure group, even if it is a friendly pressure group.
A constructive one. A constructive, yeah, I think, was the word they used.
Exactly. But I think that is obviously more the Home Office view, and at the moment it feels as though it is the Treasury view that is winning in terms of the government debate.
OK, Katie, thank you. Well, I want to stick with you on another policy offering, this time from Labour, because Sir Keir Starmer is going to be talking about another of his national missions this week. We're expecting a big speech on education and opportunity. The Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, was out on the airwaves today. She was preparing the ground. She said Labour wanted to reset the relationship with the government and teachers. What are we expecting, Katie, do you think?
So this has been in the works for some time, and Bridget Phillips has been talking a lot about this big, bold offer on childcare, and then actually Jeremy Hunt almost beat her to it when he announced the Conservatives' plan to extend what's on offer for childcare hours for the younger years. Now, what we're expecting from the speech is to be quite wide-ranging, so it will centre on the idea of background being no barrier to getting on, looking at reforming the early years, driving improvement in schools, and also skills pathways, and therefore it's part of Labour's plan with these missions to try and set out some policies, but also I think bigger vision as to where they want to get to.
And one of those new policies we heard from Bridget Phillipson today was about a new bonus for teachers to stay in the profession as an incentive payment, and that, she said, would be funded from abolishing the charitable status of private schools. So that currently means they're exempt from VAT on school fees. Does that add up to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you look at how Labour are funding quite a few of the plans, you often get back to what they're going to be doing on private schools. But often some of these things is doing a lot of work. You've mentioned several times. But I think when it comes to some of their plans on teachers and trying to raise standards, you've seen Bridget Phillipson as Shadow Education Secretary quite happy to take on some of the unions when she's talking about how schools are judged and not take the union line.
Thangham, I mean, you're responsible for planning Labour's potential legislative programme, aren't you, if the party gets into government? How quickly would you move to change the status of private schools if you won power?
Well, I mean, there's obviously a lot of good Labour policies that I would love to implement within seconds of coming into power if we're fortunate enough to win the next general election, if the country trusts us with that honour. Trying to work that out and what order to do things in is a complicated game of Jenga. And I think that it's clear with schools, with education, everything flows from that. If you don't have a world-class education system, then you don't have the labour force that you need. You don't have people fulfilling their potential. One of the reasons that I'm in politics is I live in a constituency in a city which is very unequal, in which there's a 10-year life expectancy difference. But what matters to me is that the children who come from the poorest part of my constituency should have the right to have the same access to fulfilling their potential as those who live in the richest part, and that's what frames our mission and guides us.
But you can't commit to the timescale of when you would change that status of private schools, because that's paying for quite a lot, isn't it?
I would like it to be as soon as possible, but then I also want quite a lot of other things to be as soon as possible. And right now we're working through the detail of what order we could do things in to make them as effective as possible.
Tim, Katie mentioned that we're expecting to hear a bit about childcare policy. Didn't Labour really lead the way on that, and you were basically bounced into it by the headway that Labour was making on childcare policy?
Absolutely not. I mean, there's more measures happened on childcare under this government than ever happened under previous Labour governments. And just last week we announced a further major investment for working parents on universal credit, effectively an increase of something 47% in what they're getting, but also crucially an increase in hourly rates, an extra £204 million given to local authorities, so because some of the nurses were not becoming viable. Can I just come back to Thangham here? I mean, I wager this policy on VAT and charitable status on independent schools is not going to happen. It was and I'm surprised it hasn't already been dropped already. I hadn't heard the news earlier, but they are dropping things like hotcakes at the moment. This is another of this great illusory golden.
Thangham's shaking her head here.
I'm sure she is shaking her head, but it was a few weeks ago that Bridget Phillipson announced this policy. It's going to bring in £1.7 billion supposedly. There's a think tank that's come out with a more detailed report in the last few days, said it will at best bring in £19 million, so hardly anything. But that £1.7 billion, when Bridget announced it, is going to pay for 6,500 additional teachers and support staff, and better mental health support in schools, and careers guidance and work experience and new head support.
All needed, Tim.
But today, apparently now it's going to pay as well for £2,400 to be given to early career teachers. Not quite sure what that is, until an awful lot, if you look at the social media today, an awful lot of middle career teachers are saying, hold on, what about us? Because some of these early teachers may end up getting paid more than those with a few extra years experience. And there's a real problem that we need to address. None of this addresses at all of how we retain good, decent teachers within the system, and we certainly need to do a lot more about that. But this illusory golden goose won't produce the money. It's been spent several times over. They're shortchanging our nation's youth yet again, and it's a con, I'm afraid.
I'm very grateful to Tim for reciting Labour policy live on air. I think those are excellent policies. Excellent policies. We certainly aren't going to be spending anything twice. We've got Rachel Rees, who used to work for the Bank of England, who's checking every single penny of every single calculation.
About everyone spending lots of money.
And that's a good thing, to be worried about spending taxpayers' money.
Talking about money, I mean, Katie, we are going to see more strikes by teachers this week. Can you just remind us of the state of play, or where we're up to? Because these strikes for many parents will certainly seem to have been going on for some time.
Yes, so several strikes are ultimately different sectors, but teacher strikes 5th July, 7th of July. And then you have obviously crossing over to the NHS strikes there. And when it comes to, I suppose, how does this come to an end? So far, there isn't much sign, really, that this is about to. It looks as though it's going to become quite long and quite protracted. Obviously, there's been some progress if you look at the nursing unions. Even the bouts didn't always go the way some wanted in terms of bringing some strikes to an end. But I think the fact that you already have the government talking about the pay offers for next year and putting some scepticism along with Labour on whether they will actually accept what the independent pay review bodies go for does suggest that we could have unhappiness in terms of public sector pay for some time to come. And I think just very briefly was interesting on that is, of course, the last time around, the government almost, not hid behind, but shielded themselves somewhat by relying on the independent pay review bodies when people wanted to go above them, saying we're listening to them. If they come forward with higher pay figures for the coming year, there's a chance that they say we don't want to listen to them this time because we think it's inflationary. And that's going to be quite, I think, tricky for some to hear, given what they previously said.
And Victor, the government is really leaning into that argument, aren't they, about high public sector pay awards being inflationary. What's your view on that?
I mean, there's several views. I mean, there are different views from economists about whether that's the case or not. On education, I speak as a parent, and I just want my kids to go to a school where the teachers are motivated, well-resourced, where the kids have an expectation of a decent education and don't leave school without it, and where the mental health and emotional well-being of our children can be, well, actually, I think it's not unreasonable to expect some guarantee that when your kids go to school they're safe and emotionally well. And post the pandemic, that has not been the case. And anything that improves the ability of a child to feel safe at school, well cared for and well educated, is a good thing, and I don't think too many of them do at the moment.
OK, well, we will look forward to what Labour is announcing this week. Now, on Wednesday, special events around the country will mark the 75th anniversary of the National Health Service. In London, there'll be a big service for staff in Westminster Abbey. In the evenings, public buildings and monuments will be lit up in blue to mark the occasion. Now, the NHS was born out of the Beveridge Report, which laid the foundations for the welfare state after the Second World War. It was set up, of course, by the post-war Labour government under Prime Minister Clement Attlee.
By pooling the nation's resources and paying the bill collectively, everyone is eligible. It covers all kinds of care: doctor, dentist, midwife, health visitor, oculist, and optician, and surgeon. Spectacles, dentures, appliances, and artificial limbs will be available. But a word of caution is necessary. It will take time to develop.
Now, at that time, a public information campaign encouraged people to sign up with their local doctor.
On July 5th, the new National Health Service starts. Have you chosen your family doctor? If not, ask your doctor now if he'll look after you under the new scheme. One form has to be filled in for each member of the family and then handed over to your doctor. Now, don't forget, choose your doctor now.
Seems amazing explaining that to people for the first time, doesn't it?
Yeah,
well,
really good.
I mean, at that time, the NHS was, of course, the first universal health system to be available to all, free at the point of delivery. It pioneered mass vaccination programs, new technology, innovative treatments, such as organ transplants. And if you remember the London 2012 Olympics, that opening ceremony, it demonstrated its importance. Victor, you remember that exactly, the importance to our sense of identity in the UK. But I think despite this affection, we now often speak of the NHS, don't we, in crisis. I mean, Victor, you are the chair of the NHS Confederation. It represents all the organisations making up the NHS in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. I mean, do you use that word? Do you say the word crisis when you think of the NHS now?
I do. My members use the word crisis post the pandemic and during the pandemic. You remember, we went into the pandemic with 100,000 people, 100,000 vacancies in the NHS. We've now got 112,000 vacancies, 122,000 vacancies in the NHS and 160,000 vacancies in social care. At the time that clip was made, since then, the number of people over 75 has gone up 6 times, and the number of people over 85 has gone up 8 times, and we've spent about, if you adjust for all kinds of inflation, 10 times what we were spending then. But that's to be expected. Technology, new drugs, population, that's expected. So we have faced, my members have faced an absolute tsunami of problems and challenges. And I have to tell you, every time I have the opportunity to come on the media, to thank them, because managing in those circumstances and still providing the care that they do provide for many people is heroic. And I think we should thank them for it. And I'll be at the church service on Wednesday, and I'll be thanking them, as we all should. But we also should provide them with the resources that they need to continue to provide an excellent health service for another 75 years.
I mean, you outlined some areas in which we're just in a completely different world now to the world where the NHS was set up. You said that your members use the word crisis. What is the remedy?
Well, I mean, we very much welcome the workforce plan. I think we've been crying out for it for some time. In fact, when I started this job, we were asking for a workforce plan, and we finally got one. There are challenges to implement that plan at this time when we've got junior doctors strike, consultants talking about coming on strike, radiographers coming on strike, is a real challenge. And I agree with the chief executive of NHS England when she said this is not a good time to be going on strike. We need to settle these strikes. But the workforce plan is one leg of a 3-leg stool. So workforce, great. We need to sort that workforce in social care, because that's the block. And as I said, there's 160,000 care vacancies. We've got a £10 billion backlog in capital spending, which is also really affecting productivity as well. So we need to sort that out. So workforce, that's one leg. Social care, that's another. And capital spending, that's another. And we've got the stool stable. But it's also on a very uneven surface. So we need to do some things to build the care of the whole nation. We now understand that healthcare isn't just about the NHS. So we need health in all policies if we're going to improve the health of the nation.
And is it just about money?
No, it's not just about money, but money helps, and we've been starved of money, and you know, the workforce plan has £2 billion attached to it for the first 2 years. It's a 15-year plan, 15-year plan. So we need to hear from all parties, actually, that they're going to fund it going forward and review it going forward, because circumstances change, and they change faster now because of the nature of demographics than they did in the 1930s and 1940s when the NHS started. The NHS England should be congratulated actually on pulling together the workforce plan, the government for funding it, but it needs cross-party support, and we need the social care workforce to be sorted out. We need them to be paid, and we need the capital so we can get hospitals working without their roofs falling in.
Fangham, it's not all about money, but money helps. Would Labour give the NHS the money it needs if it was in government?
I mean, we've already said that we would scrap the non-dom tax break for the super rich to make sure people who live here actually pay their fair share, and we would use that money for workforce planning. And that's the main difference I can see so far with the Tory announcements over the last few days, is I don't know where they're getting the money from. Frankly, I'm a bit bored of this. If I'd come on the airwaves and said we're going to have all these new doctors and nobody had actually found out where we were going to pay for them, we wouldn't get anywhere, would we? And as, you know, Tim's already tried to check my working. Now, prevention is incredibly important. I think that's part, if it's a 3-legged stool, I think maybe it's a 4th leg, or part of one of the other 3.
Certainly, social care would, spending on social care would be an act of prevention.
It would, but I think if we retrofit homes so that there aren't children and vulnerable adults living in cold, damp, hard-to-heat homes, if we have a Clean Air Act, if we tackle the maternal mortality gap between black women and white women, where black women are 4 times as likely as white women to die in childbirth, if we have mental health hubs, as Victor talked earlier about the mental health for children at schools, those are things which are partly about money, but they're also about doing things in a different way and looking at the National Health Service not just about treatment, but actually about health and about doing things in a healthy way. And therefore, retrofitting a homes policy isn't just a housing policy, it's a health policy. And thinking about how we have more hospital at home, for example, which is, again, using the same resources but in a different way, so that people are able to be treated at home wherever possible, discharged sometimes from hospital into home, making sure that the community pharmacies, the health visitors, the district nurses are there to support people to recover from an operation or recover from treatment where possible and safe at home. Those are all things you can do in a different way.
Tim, can I come to you? Thangham's talking about joined up thinking when it comes to health in other policy areas. Is that something that you think would help the NHS, more intervention in other areas? I mean, we've heard talk about gambling, action on gambling. Lots of experts would like to see action on ultra-processed foods. We've had the government back away, for example, from buy one, get one free offers on junk foods in supermarkets. What about action in other areas of policy that could actually help the NHS in the long term?
I completely agree with all of that. And there are a couple of things I wanted to add to Victor's list: workforce, social care and capital backlog. And to that does need to be added prevention and a much better public health and early intervention policy, and also technology. And it's very interesting when you speak to MPs who have got a background in medicine. They all say, and absolutely right, there are very few problems with the National Health Service that don't all lead back to better workforce planning. And the announcement by the government the other day is really, really significant. We can all say it should have happened years ago. It should have happened years ago under a Labour government too. But actually, it's a really game-changing policy that's come up here. We've got lots more doctors, we've got lots more nurses over the last 13 years. The trouble is the population has gone up considerably as well. The backlog of things which built up during the pandemic has gone up considerably. And we've got lots of vacancies, as that Victor quite rightly says, in both the health service and social care. So the announcement by the government about doubling the number of medical school places, introducing medical degree apprenticeships, expanding dentistry training places where there is a real problem, and doing also a lot about retaining good staff. It's the point I made on teachers just now. We need to be looking after our staff better, and pay is part of that, but there are lots of other things we can do, ensuring greater flexibility for staff, access to health and wellbeing support. We've modernised the NHS pension scheme, which I'm afraid Thangham's party voted against. And I'm afraid, look, we just announced an extra £46 billion going to the health service. If we're only relying on investment in the health service by abolishing the non-DOMS tax break, well, that again is another illusory golden goose, because it will actually cost rather than bring anything in. So it's so much more than that. On the preventative side, you're absolutely right. Obesity is one of the biggest things that take resources in the National Health Service. We are the fat man of Europe. We have got to do so much more about educating people, eating more healthily, and we've got to treat things like gambling and also drug addiction. We're doing a report on this at the moment on the Home Affairs Select Committee as a public health crisis as well. It's a balance of law enforcement, but also making sure people have got alternatives and keep them on the straight and narrow. And that's where the preventative side of it comes in, and that's why all the technology announcements that have also come in the last few days, the new digital NHS health checks on cardiovascular disease.
Tim, I'm going to just stop you there because I've got Victor and Thangham both wanting to come in. Victor, very briefly.
Well, I mean, that's what I meant by health in all policies. The NHS cannot carry the health of the nation on its own. We need a new settlement with people and the public about what the NHS can and can't do, and politicians to actually put health in all policies. On public health, we talk about prevention. We've actually had a 26% cut in the public health grant between 2015 and now. So when I say health in all policies, I include public health as well. We could improve the health of this nation over a 5-year period and actually reduce the demand on the NHS, but we have to put health in all policies: education, public health, food, these transport. These are all contributors to the nation's health.
Sangam, I just want to ask you on the NHS itself, the idea of game-changing policies, which is how Tim described the workforce plan, on the idea of kind of big reforms. Do you think that we are slightly squeamish as a nation about big reform of the NHS because we are attached, protective, sentimental to it? Is that something you think? Victor, you're shaking your head as well.
We've just had a big reform. We've just had a big reform. We have 42 ICSs and ICBs that have brought distributed leadership, brought the NHS closer to communities. We need to let that reform happen. We need to support it.
And we need explain ICSs.
Sorry, integrated care. Integrated care systems. The population health. So your population is managed by an integrated care system. Apologies for that. We need to let these reforms bed in, and we need to let them do some of the things that they're doing to integrate health and social care so that people get a better joined up NHS.
Hang on, very briefly, if you will.
Well, clearly the NHS has been transformed in its lifetime. We heard with a wry smile some of those recordings of what it was like at the start. It's transformed since then. I did notice that Tim didn't mention where the money was coming from with the government's NHS workforce plan, though I am glad that they've pinched Labour's idea of having one. You're welcome, Tim.
Okay, well, I sense we could go on for much longer on this, but I'm afraid, really sadly, we have to leave that there. Katie, we have the front pages of tomorrow's papers in. Very briefly, if you will, take us through what is on them.
Yeah, a mix of front pages. So Daily Express, doctors raise spectre of NHS strikes until 2025. But then on the front of the Times, a ray of light, potentially. Doctors win pay pledge if they call off strikes. And this is an interview the Health Secretary has given to the Times, where he says that he is willing to give doctors a bigger pay rise, but ultimately says both sides have to give. So watch that space. Nothing proper yet.
So dangling something potentially.
Exactly, depending on who has to give more. Daily Telegraph, banks must respect free speech of customers. This comes after, I think, ultimately this is banks are to be told by the Treasury that they must protect free speech and an escalating row over the blacklisting of customers, linked to Nigel Farage, of course, recently saying that he had been cut off by his bank. And then at the front of the Daily Mail, you have put brakes on damaging 2030 petrol car ban, and this is ultimately polling for the Daily Mail, which the paper is using to suggest that ministers would be best to ease off the pedal on their drive towards banning petrol and diesel cars by 2030. More than half disagree with the rush to switch to electric cars.
Okay, so a bit of a mixed bag. I'm just going to ask Victor very briefly for the last word. The NHS strikes, I mean, how damaging will they be?
They'll be very damaging. We've lost over 600,000 operations in the last 6 months as a result of strikes. Amanda Pritchard and I and my members want them to stop, and the only way they can be stopped is if both sides get around the negotiation table.
Well, we will watch this space, as Katie said. Well, that is all we have time for this evening, I'm afraid. Many thanks to all of my guests, Katie Balls, Thangam Debonair, Tim Lawton and Victor Adebowale. Do join us at the same time next week, but for now, from all of us here at the Westminster Hour, a very good night.
The editor was Libby Jukes, the producer Maddie Trimmer and the studio manager Robin Schroeder.
You don't know what this means to all of us.
On BBC iPlayer, you'll find what you love.
Can't believe we're actually doing this.
And love what you find.
I am the leader of this expedition.
Binge watch brilliant shows.
Yes! Oh, mate, that's impressive.
From the latest.
I'm Princess Georgiana. Shall we get going?
To the greatest.
Nice to meet you, I'm the Doctor.
And live stream BBC TV.
Spin the wheel!
Find your next big obsession.
Call me Annika.
On BBC iPlayer.
Now, what makes the news is a decision made by editorial teams with their own view of what's newsworthy. But does the demand for immediate clickbait over thoughtful analysis create a news environment which is out of kilter with what matters? That's the question for the Moral Maze, coming up in a couple of minutes. BBC News at 11 o'clock. President Macron has been meeting ministers and security officials to discuss the rioting that swept France. The unrest was triggered by the fatal shooting of a teenager by police in Paris. His grandmother has appealed for calm, saying his death should not be used as an excuse for violence. Danielle Obono, who's a left